So we're bang on 12:30 and Gwen can absolutely stay there. There's no talking about happiness and she's a good encapsulation of that, I think. So welcome to those online. If you have any issues with sound, please just let me know just by unmuting yourself and letting us know. Okay. A few more people on, I think. So everyone can hear us loud and clear? Great. So I'd like to start by acknowledging the traditional custodians of Dharawal country, where we meet today, and I'd like to pay my respect to elders past, present and emerging. And I'd also like to acknowledge and extend my respect to any Aboriginal or Torres Strait Islander people here today. So my name is Nadine. I've met some of you, haven't met all of you. I'm really delighted that you can join us here today at lunchtime for this conversation. I have with me my friend and colleague, Associate Professor Jordan McKenzie, who is from the University of Wollongong, our neighbours. And Jordan and I have been having a conversation for a little while about this topic. Just wanted to read Jordan's bio so you get a sense of the work he's doing. He completed his PhD at Flinders University in South Australia and is now an associate professor in sociology. His research is largely informed by European social and critical theory, and these perspectives contribute to his current research in the sociology of emotions. In particular, he critically engages with the normative dimensions of happiness and the good life in order to better understand how emotional experiences reflect modernisation and social change. Most recently, his work has focused on future-oriented emotions in perceptions of environmental disaster and apocalypse scenarios. His book, Dystopian Emotions, is an introduction to the field alongside Jordan's articles and book chapters on prepping, climate anxiety, and dystopia. And I actually have a copy of Jordan's first book here. It's called Deconstructing Happiness, and it was published by Routledge. And I was lucky enough to get it from the University of Newcastle as an interlibrary loan, and I had a great time looking through it a few months ago. So highly recommend that if you're interested in critical happiness studies. So we can start at the beginning, which is where this all kind of began, this conversation. So Jordan and I have actually done something like this before. In a few months ago, we had a similar conversation at the University of Wollongong, and I was the stranger then, and people didn't know who I was. And now Jordan is the person you might not know much about. So I frightened him before and I was like, the spotlight is on you, Jordan, not me. So please expect to hear from Jordan today on his work and his views on these matters that we're exploring. So I think I might launch in and ask you about your field, because not everyone here would be familiar with this term, critical happiness studies. A lot of people know a little bit about happiness through positive psychology, even through Buddhism to a certain extent, but they might not understand what critical happiness studies is and whether or not critical happiness studies takes a pessimistic view when it comes to human happiness, or if it offers something different.
So I think the starting point there would be, I think Sarah Ahmed's work on critical happiness studies is a nice way in, where she sort of attempts to change the conversation from what is happiness to what does happiness do, and what is, as a sociologist, my initial interest was in around the sort of the social function of happiness, but also thinking about happiness in terms of macro and sort of large scale phenomenon. So when I was working on that book, and when I was writing my PhD, I was, I guess, just not satisfied with all of the kinds of materials that I was finding on happiness. At that time, the sort of pop psychology and self-help movement was very big, and I think it was informed by sometimes some somewhat questionable interpretations of positive psychology and philosophy and religion. And I think a lot of my work comes out of me just not being very satisfied with what I found and trying to do something different. And so critical happiness studies didn't really exist as a genre, or at least I wasn't aware of it existing. This is probably 2008 when I was starting this work. But there was loads of stuff on happiness. Everyone was talking about happiness. I wanted to ask sort of bigger questions, I guess, about the social function of happiness, about what it does and how it interacts with things like hegemony and normativity and critique. But also with my background in Frankfurt School critical theory, I wanted to try and come at the question of happiness in modernity from, I guess, a view that that modernity and whatever we think that is has an emotional impact on human beings. And like to me, I'm already off topic, I feel, but to me, this in a lot of ways goes all the way back to like classic sociology in terms of someone like Emile Durkheim. So Emile Durkheim arguably does the first ever statistical sociological study on suicide. And in that, importantly, he's able to demonstrate that macro social structures like religion, class, community have an impact on people's emotional states and the sort of emotional motivations for their decisions. And I found that despite this kind of sort of origin in sociology, some of the literature about happiness was very individualistic and very individually focused. It was about how do I, as an individual, increase my happiness, and certainly that is the approach that that positive psychology has taken. And at the same time, philosophy historically has asked maybe more ontological questions about like what is happiness, what is the nature of happiness. I was interested in something really quite different. This question of what does happiness do? What is the social function? How does it shape everyday life? So coming to your question about is critical happiness studies pessimistic? It's not so much pessimistic as it is critical, because I think it highlights the fact that happiness is seen as this thing that is ultimately always good, especially in kind of like, Western modernity and its obsession with happiness pursuits. Happiness is seen as this thing that could never not be good. What could possibly be wrong with happiness? And so, someone like Sarah Ahmed or people like Siddisram and Spicer in their work point out, I think, quite important ways in which happiness and people's kind of like genuine, I think, very honorable desire to pursue happiness becomes a kind of like a sort of backdoor way for things to be done to people that are more sinister. And so, Sarah Ahmed talks about, for example, like gender roles and the sort of hegemony of gender roles and how that is kind of built into what she calls promise of happiness that can become quite threatening and quite dark if you kind of veer off the path, the sort of well-beaten path of what's expected of us by society. So I wouldn't say necessarily that critical happiness studies is anti-happiness. It's just sort of looking at this question of like, in what ways does happiness do things that could potentially be harmful to us or could be problematic? In what ways are there kind of happiness traps in society through things like consumerism or certain aspects of philosophy or religion or ethics. And so it's just kind of opening a critical eye to all of that.
Mm-hmm. Which is something that people here might not be that familiar with, because I think they probably would assume that happiness is a good thing. And a lot of people interested in Buddhism in particular are pursuing what they perceive as happiness. So in a way, what we're doing is we're problematizing and questioning some of those assumptions and looking a bit deeper, because I think that, happiness amongst many other concepts can be placeholders for other types of concepts and functions and, as you say, objects. And so I know that Sarah Ahmed talks a little bit about happiness objects. And so it's like, what do we place happiness in? And you talked about normativity. That might be a word that people aren't that familiar with, but it's, I think you're pointing to the fact that there are certain expectations and norms in society. Like, for example, a heterosexual relationship is one such norm that we've seen in Western society over a very long period of time. Now that's being disrupted and changed happily over the last 10 to 20 years. But by and large, this is a value that a lot of people focus on, and it's a place where they, I suppose, store their happiness or their aspirations for happiness. And so thinking critically about, what is it that makes us happy is, I think, a really interesting question as well.
Yeah, and I think to me that that's actually one of those questions that reaffirms to me why this is a sociologically rich subject. Because I mean, when I first started working on this, I had some pushback from senior academics who would say, this is a kind of fluffy topic. Sociologists should be talking about class and race and stuff like that. And what is this sort of happiness? But like when I'm talking to my students about this, and I'm trying to sort of convey to them how certain things can be sociologically analyzed. To me, the most basic test is, does it change over time? And is it different in different places?
Yeah.
And if it is, then there's some element of construction going on in there, right? That these things are culturally formulated, that they're not sort of like universal kinds of answers. And the fact that happiness means such different things in different places, and not in random sorts of ways, but certain kinds of cultures with certain kinds of religious histories and ethical histories have really different kinds of understandings. The difference between happiness as it's used in China, for example, as opposed to Germany, as opposed to the United States, it really does reflect other aspects of those cultures as well. It's not like a random definition, but they're all distinct from one another. And even, happiness in Australia in 2025 is probably very different to what it looked like in 1950. And so happiness is a sort of moving target there. And it almost is a kind of, a sort of empty category in which we can sort of put whatever we want into, that I think says a lot about us when we say, like, this is what happiness means to me. In a way, I'm probably saying more about what I value rather than what I actually think this external concept is. And that's why I think, to me, as a sociologist, it's such an interesting reflection of culture and of a particular community, a particular time. And so, you mentioned the thing about the heteronormativity, for example, and happiness. And one of the things that Ahmed does really nicely is she talks about things like queer happiness or migrant happiness. Like, what do these non-mainstream versions of happiness narratives look like? Something I'm really interested in Australia is we could talk about Australian happiness, but what about Indigenous happiness? What does that look like? And how is that maybe underrepresented or ignored? And I think when we start to talk about what does happiness look like to a migrant family, and how does that differ from a non-migrant family, you start to learn really interesting things about people's aspirations, about their hopes, about their values, about what really matters to them.
Yeah, it's kind of shorthand in a way. If you ask someone what makes you happy, you can learn a lot about them. And I think consumerism is something you touched on, and I think this audience would be really interested to just hear a bit more about that, because I think we are so conditioned. And even if we're anti-consumerist, I often think happiness is a good cup of coffee. The way I'm thinking about happiness is absolutely conditioned by my consumer identity in this culture. And so I think in a way capitalism has absolutely leveraged the happiness movement for its own purposes. Is that something you found as well?
Oh yeah, absolutely. And the critical theorists that I'm interested in are quick to talk about this. People like Herbert Marcuse are very, very interested in the kind of happiness traps, I suppose, that can exist within late capitalism or within consumer culture. I think part of the reason for me why I actually think that happiness is sometimes maybe not that interesting is I actually think we live in a time, and I say we here in terms of living in, a first world, fairly privileged country, that happiness and joy can be very easily attained in the ways that you talk about. Happiness is a good cup of coffee, or a, warm bath or something like that. And in those scenarios, happiness is really not that difficult or not that complicated, but it is fleeting, and it is kind of, something that is not satisfying for a long period of time. And I think consumer capitalism has a way of tapping into that in ways that it knows exactly what it's doing, in terms of giving us, dopamine hits through Instagram, or giving us some sort of satisfaction from buying products that inevitably will disappoint us and inevitably will make us then want something else. And so you have this kind of happiness sort of hedonic treadmill of consumerism. And that I think is obviously by design, it's not accidental. And I think in some ways I understand why people would want to withdraw from that, but I also acknowledge how hard it is to do that. We live in a society where debt, for example, is, Australia has one of the highest rates of credit card debt in the world. It's very easy to kind of fall into that habit of this thing is going to make me happy. But then the long-term effects of that are obviously kind of catastrophic.
Yeah. environmental degradation being a primary
Yes.
consequence. Yeah. Yeah, that's interesting. I mean, I think that in a way, the voluntary simplicity movement and those types of anti-consumption movements peaked quite some time ago, like in the 90s. Even minimalism as a movement. I haven't seen a lot of that recently. I don't know if it's just drowned out. My algorithm doesn't support that anymore. It supports different types of coffee instead. But and I really hope there are some social movements that are resisting some of these trends. I'm not sure how strong they are, but I wanted to say that Buddhism certainly represents one such trend. And so even though, mindfulness has also been co-opted by capitalism and is often seen as a way to instant gratification or satisfaction, I think that many people come to Buddhism because they are dissatisfied with the system and they realize that a good cup of coffee is not going to keep them satisfied beyond an hour, right? And so they're looking for something more lasting, which really brings me to my next question. And it's about the terminology, because you and I have talked about, this notion of contentment and joy and pleasure, and then happiness. And to me, I mean, I could be speaking out of turn here, but happiness has got more of a sense of meaning to it than those other terms. And I wondered if you could speak a bit to those different terms as well.
Yeah, that's interesting. But one thing I noticed really quickly when I started looking into this is that among philosophers and psychoanalysts and sociologists, there's a tendency to always kind of define happiness in two terms. So there's like playing against one another of like individual versus social happiness, or happiness in terms of temporality, happiness in the moment as opposed to happiness in reflection, or like in a lot of the different kinds of theoretical approaches, there is like two kinds of happiness. This is like a really just very common thing that I found. And in my own version of this, I talk about happiness and contentment. And what I try and split apart there is kind of happiness as feelings of joy and pleasure in the moment, and then contentment as a sort of positive life evaluation or positive life reflection.
That's interesting, because I have it the other way around in my mind. Yeah.
Yeah, right.
Yeah.
Right. And I think, I mean, in the mainstream discourse, like people aren't using these words strategically and differently. So I'm always having to think about the fact that even not very strict about the way I use this. Like we just kind of say happiness as though it's all the same thing. And sort of pulling those two things apart can reveal a lot about maybe what it is that we're really talking about.
Yeah.
Because contentment can involve lots of very unhappy times. Like I'm very content with my job and I get a great sense of contentment from teaching students, but it's not always very happy. There are days where I'd rather not go to work, and that's kind of totally standard. I'm kind of quite interested to see actually how that then fits or doesn't fit with the sort of Buddhist perspectives that you're more familiar with, because for me, then the contentment part is about identity and character, and it's about recognition. Part of why I find contentment in my job is because I have a job that is socially valued. And so people are nice to me about it. Whereas if I used to work in a call center when I was an undergraduate student, people did not value that job and people were mean to me.
Yeah.
And so there's a sense in which I get a degree of recognition from that. And that's certainly, that validation is part of the contentment experience. But there's also a temporal factor in terms of longer term things. But there's also a sort of recognition that within that there's a lot of suffering, it would be one word. There's a lot of hard work. There's a lot of unpleasant experiences that go into creating something that I would think is contentment. I know that is something that I think like Buddhism does a much better job of recognizing than a lot of other sort of happiness approaches. So talk me through how suffering fits into this.
It's a complex kind of question because you can think of it from multiple angles, and I'll just try and give you a few things that come to mind. Firstly, what you were describing sounds a bit like the hero's journey, which is something that we're all very, very familiar with. And it's a monomyth that often gets applied to Buddhism as well. Because this notion that like meditation should not be easy, that you will confront your demons, that there'll be dark states, that there'll be discomfort. And we're doing that all in service of the freedom of suffering, which is our ultimate goal. From one Buddhist perspective.
It sounds like doing a PhD.
Exactly. So it's a similar narrative, right? And so just to reflect back that, many of us share that view that you need to somehow, slay the dragon in order to succeed and in order to experience a sense of meaning. Now, from a Buddhist perspective, it's interesting because I think the modern Buddhist perspective has a lot of emphasis on this present moment. I call it present momentism. And it's this idea that joy and happiness should happen right now in the present moment. Right. There are reasons why, historical reasons why that particular approach and that particular doctrine has gained so much traction in the Western world, and why it works well with capitalism, because we are able to indulge and, enjoy a good piece of chocolate cake in the present moment. And as long as we're mindful, right, then we don't need to worry too much. We're not doing anything sinful, or we're appreciating life and opening to life. And I think, in a way, I get it and I relate to that idea, but that doesn't really encapsulate Buddhism. And a lot of people reduce Buddhism in that way. And so I try not to. If I think of it from a Buddhist perspective, then, there are various feeling states that we experience that are changing moment by moment in our day. And that's not a mistake. That's conditioned reality. So we might be experiencing pain and then pleasure and then neutral feelings. We might be experiencing images and memories we're talking about imagination, so dreams and our imagination that might feel pleasant, unpleasant, or neutral. And basically, it's a changing feast. And from one Buddhist perspective, the kind of early Buddhist perspective, the invitation is to notice this changing, moving reality, so that we can acknowledge that we're not creating it or controlling it. We might be influencing it, but we're certainly not the master of our reality. Also to notice that suffering is kind of inbuilt into our systems, so we can unravel from it gradually, but just acknowledging that suffering is real. And lastly, noticing that whatever bad is happening, whatever stress you're experiencing, that will change. And also whatever happiness you're experiencing, that will change as well. And there are some good quotes in the Pali Canon about the Buddha saying, when you notice someone's happy, enjoy that. Be, very, very pleased that they're happy, because they will suffer. Yeah. It's a bit dark.
But fair.
But fair. It is fair. Yeah. So that encourages this kind of communal shared happiness that I've written about and we've talked about a bit. And I think actually Sarah Ahmed talks about communal joy as well, which is the joy that the individual doesn't necessarily own. And so from a Buddhist perspective, we are gunning for communal joy. So when someone else gets a promotion, that is your delight. And when you get a promotion, it's like, no, I don't want to get too attached to that, it's gonna turn into suffering soon. And so we're very cautious about our own happiness from a Buddhist perspective. Yeah. So I don't know if I've answered that. I've given you some thoughts.
If I could throw a third option in, go on. I talked about how everything is in these these dichotomies. Yeah. There's a rare third option in Kant in his critique of judgment, where he talks about, in effect, kind of individual happiness and social happiness, and not sort of that difference, the way you just described it with the promotion. Then he describes this third version, which is effectively like experiencing happiness in the beautiful. And what's distinct about that is that the beautiful object or the beautiful something, whatever it happens to be, does literally nothing for us, and yet it brings us joy. And so in terms of, I might be happy for you because you get a promotion, but also you're my friend. And there's a degree in which you having success also benefits my life, because, we are connected. Kant offers this third option, which almost never gets taken up anywhere. And you could think about appreciating a great artwork, for example, where you are not going to own it, you're not going to benefit from it. I guess you could say that maybe you benefit some way from it in terms of by a certain kind of cultural capital or something like that. But ultimately, just the fact that it exists and knowing that it exists brings you a sense of joy, even though it does nothing for you. And I think about nature maybe in that way. And it's a nice kind of third option that sociologists often do get very hung up on the individual and society and not the rest of it.
Yeah, I think it does reflect this notion of non-attachment in Buddhism, which is that, when a magpie calls, we don't think, that is my magpie call. Can you do it again? We experience it and enjoy it and we let it go. Yeah. And so in that way, we are honouring this notion of anatta in Buddhism, which is non-self, as in non-clinging to something as though it's mine. Yeah. Okay. So just moving on now, in this book, you've referred to a lot of Western philosophers, including Marx, which is kind of strange to put Marx in a book about happiness, but you can tell us why.
Marx wrote his,
yeah, go on.
Marx wrote his PhD thesis
Really?
about Epicurus and about happiness. So sorry,
No.
There's the rest of the question. I don't want to jump in.
Oh, I was just going to say, class struggle, but yeah, no, I was just going to say, yes, you hang a lot of this on this notion of the good life. That was where my question was going. So please continue. Go.
So, look, one thing I have been on about for a long time is that I think sociology has always been interested in happiness and the good life. And I think with Marx, the early Marx is more sort of humanist and more poetic, more, he was writing sonnets and songs and all these sorts of things. He was, young Marx was a lot like young Marxists. And then late Marx, he becomes more of an economist, more structuralist in his thinking, and much more focused on exploitation. And he kind of forgets the individual in a way. And there's this real tension between early and late Marx. But I think in a way, both of them are interested in happiness. I mean, in the more humanist version, he is interested more in emotion. But in the later Marx, even though he forgets the individual, he starts talking about, the structural roadblocks that, like capitalism is exploitation that prevents human happiness. And, what's the famous quote it's in the Ideology where he talks about that, we should work for a certain amount of time, we should fish, we should read poetry. He doesn't like the idea that effectively, appreciating art becomes something the bourgeois can do while everyone else works in the factories. It's about kind of everybody else being able to experience pleasure and joy and fulfillment. And so, like in my mind, it's the interest in happiness has always been there in sociology, but it's been more critical. It's been more about like, what is it that's preventing people from accessing happiness, or what is it that is making happiness accessible for some but not others? Whether it's men but not women, or the wealthy but not the poor. And so I think, that has kind of always been there. In terms of connecting it to the good life, I think that's where I start to think about happiness as narrative and happiness as a social norm. Like, and there I'm particularly interested in like, how is it that as a society we come up with a particularly specific idea, like the American dream, for example, of like what a sort of normative vision of the good life kind of looks like. And I find it really interesting how that is negotiated as a collective process, but also pushed back against and critiqued. But it also becomes this justification for all these things that we're doing that that we might not otherwise do.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, really important to interrogate that. And I was thinking about it from the Buddhist perspective because, again, there's nothing explicit in early Buddhism that talks about, the good life and happiness, but we can deduce from what the Buddha's saying that he's suggesting that a kind of ethical life, a life that's grounded in what we call the precepts. So making sure you're not stealing, lying, or committing sexual adultery, and you have space and time for contemplation and your own self-cultivation is, a way that you might see the Buddhist good life. But it is very much grounded in this ethical way of seeing things and integrity, which is often missed when we just talk about mindfulness. We don't see ethics as the foundation necessarily. And I do think we live in a society where there's a kind of secular ethics as well. There are lots of different types of ethics. In a hospital, there's a certain type of ethics. In a university, there's another type. And so it's not like we live in a society that's free of ethics. But as we've talked about just before, capitalism means that ethics are somewhat skewed.
Somewhat.
And things are going in a bit of a poor direction. Yeah.
I mean, there's a quote in Adorno that I always come back to, which is effectively he argues that the wrong life cannot be lived rightly, right? And that in a world that is corrupted, and in a world that is, built on exploitation and discrimination and various forms of, social structures that ensure that, power and wealth is concentrated in the hands of a few. He kind of argues that as individuals trying to live in that world, there's not a right way of living that's going to fix that. Like the change is structural. And like he uses this really powerful and I think interesting example of homelessness, where he talks about, when you see someone who's living on the street and who's having a really difficult time, how you feel about them does nothing for them. You know, whether there's no right way to feel about that suffering that is going to make their circumstances better.
Yeah.
And so we might put this pressure on ourselves to feel the right way, to feel an ethical way about them and about their circumstances. But ultimately, like, they are there because, you know, the system has failed them in a certain kind of way, or because there are sort of inequalities that are well out of my control. And so the reason I like that example, I think that example is interesting, is because it kind of flips to, I promise I'm going to bring this back. But
You're going to learn this.
it brings me back to this point that Georg Simmel makes when he talks about this thing called the blasé attitude. And he talks about how to live in the modern metropolis, we have to become blasé about things. And what he means by that is sort of we have to desensitize our emotions in order to live in modern societies. That modern societies are so big and sprawling, and in many ways so cruel, that if my heart really went out to every person I see who's living on the street, and I tried to stop and help all of them, like, I wouldn't get to work on time. I would lose my job. I would not pay rent. I would not be able to survive. And it's, in some ways, we have to sort of make ourselves cold to this. And there is this kind of like sort of trend of sort of de-emotionalizing ourselves, and in order to live in modern cities and modern societies. And what I think is interesting is that in the context of that, we've seen this massive growth in happiness, and people wanting happiness, and people wanting to find happiness, and like sort of almost like desensitizing our emotional selves and then trying to bring something back in. But then in terms of where we can get that from and what we can do with that, maybe the advice we're getting isn't always great.
That's really interesting, Jordan. And I think Buddhism plays a role there. I mean, Buddhism has been so successful in the Western world and in the zeitgeist in various forms. And I think I just wanted to make the point, when I mentioned contemplation, it's not an end in itself from a Buddhist perspective.
Yeah.
Like, we are becoming more sensitive, and we are becoming more compassionate, and we are becoming more generous. And the Buddha was quite socially aware, suggested that we, donate a certain portion of our wage to others. And so tax was kind of inbuilt from a Buddhist perspective. But also, we are trying to sense into our interbeing as Buddhist practitioners. And so, and just from my own experience in meditation practice, you do go through a process of coming out of the numbing that we often find ourselves in through work, through, capitalist culture, overstimulation. We often feel very numb and detached. And I think there is a resensitization that happens through meditation. And sometimes that can be really overwhelming, because we see there are all these people who have been used to this kind of this modern world, and they go into like a retreat situation for 30 days, then they come out and they're walking down the street, and all of a sudden the world is way too intense. And so I think there's some place for Buddhism in that process, and it's been used in that way. And so I mean, it's, in a way, we're moving out of indifference, we're moving out of disassociation into something more connected. But whether we can tolerate that level of connection, because we are now hyper connected, from a sociological perspective, we're probably too connected and things are moving too quickly without much thought, really.
So I think what I want to add to that, and I think I think you're absolutely right. Like, I think that process of like reconnecting, and like with self and with others through kind of stripping away other things, I think is incredibly valuable. I think the question I want to ask there is around, like, for me, the question of what is the good life is really, to me, indistinguishable, or at least inseparable from what is the good society, right? And that, I think this is one of the great mistakes of happiness research. But I think, I've also had this background in utopia and dystopia studies, and I think I really genuinely struggle to believe. I was still shocked by how little utopian and dystopian literature, not necessarily fiction, but literature, talks about happiness. Like, it's all structural, it's all societal, and then there's very little actual discussion of emotion and happiness. And in the happiness and emotions literature, there's almost no discussion of society, right? And that, like, I think the two have to be studied together. Like, when we ask, like, what is the good life, in a way, the question I'm thinking about there, or maybe the question I'm trying to answer, is what is the kind of society that would support a good life, or that would make the good life accessible to people. And that, to me, that is like one and the same question, but it's not in practice in terms of the research that exists. And so, in a way, this is a very ignorant question, because I feel like you know more about my work than I know about yours. But I mean, what would a Buddhist approach look like there in terms of like that association? Is there a link there between what is the good life and the good society as being like overlapping inquiries, or are they more distinct?
It's a really good question, and I'll answer it. But I first want to say that that my PhD was on utopian communities, and so I spoke to a lot of people who were very committed to utopian visions, and they rarely spoke about individual happiness. They were talking about what made them happy was enacting a utopian vision.
Yes,
that was what compelled.
It's obvious. You just do the right thing, and then it will follow.
Yeah, and so like their meaning, their sense of worth, their contentment came through building a kind of micro society, something that they would like to live in, and hoping that has ripple effects, and that people will start to do something similar. So I went and spoke to a lot of people in eco villages, and also some Buddhist communities as well, and the San Francisco Zen Center and Upaya Zen Center in New Mexico. And they too were utopian, actually. I mean, it's a beautiful vision, and the vision really relates to working together, so harmony and coherence as a community. And the Buddha was very keen on talking about that, particularly in the Vinaya, which is the code for monastics, because he was encouraging groups of monastics to live together. And obviously there are going to be lots of problems and controversies and issues around distribution and accessibility, and so he had some very well-defined prescriptive guidelines. Now we can kind of extrapolate and suggest that some of those guidelines could be in a watered-down way applied to us as lay people, based on what he said. He also had some advice directly for lay people, but he was socially minded. And so, not taking more than what is given and what you receive is a huge principle. So minimalism, really. And avoiding overindulgence and ensuring that you are looking after others. So, for example, the Buddha was suggesting that monastics look after their dying brothers, as in monastic brothers or sisters. And so they were very active in palliative care for those who were dying in the Buddhist order. And so those stories, you get a lot of stories like that. You realise that his vision is broader than the individual. And so I think communities grounded in care, communities grounded in ethics, communities that are minimalist, and that do support everyone equally. And Buddhism's a largely democratic, horizontal religion, though over time, organisations and hierarchies have emerged invariably. But by and large, the idea is that, everyone should have equal opportunity, women, men, and that's been a huge emphasis and for this particular tradition in Buddhism at the Nantian Temple. So, yeah.
So it's like, what's interesting to me there is that happiness becomes almost a project of community building, right? Or society making, right? And that's something that I think doesn't come through in a lot of the mainstream sort of popular discussions about happiness, which are still very inwardly focused and very much about my personal happiness for my benefit as opposed to collective benefit.
Well, that's right. And I mean, if you want to take a really radical approach as a Buddhist, you might say that there is no individual psyche from a Buddhist perspective. I mean, of course, I, agree that there's something going on in my head right now, but those boundaries between inside and outside, they drop away from a Buddhist perspective, and the whole world is our psyche, is our temple. And so I think when you really drill down and you get to the heart of the matter, it is not an individualistic religion as it has been presented.
Yeah. Well, I mean, and there are, not to sort of hijack that, I mean, there is to some extent sociological versions of that. I mean, there are I would argue that the individual society dichotomy is deeply flawed. And that individuals only exist as members of a society, and societies only exist as a combination of individuals, and that the isolated individual kind of doesn't exist in a way. I mean, we can kind of look for that. We can be more or less isolated, but ultimately we are social beings, and we can't help but be social beings. And I think we want to connect with others. It's important that we connect with others. And so we can inwardly reflect, and we do, and I think that's important. But I mean, like I think of like Paul Ricoeur has this beautiful line where he says that I belong to history before I belong to myself. And I think that is something I think about a lot.
Yeah.
Which is that I wasn't born into that sort of blank slate, and I was born into ideas around, masculinity or whiteness or class or religion. All of these things existed for a very long time, and I was kind of born into those things. And then I have to sort of make sense of my life within that, not necessarily in a way that is entirely of my own sort of choosing. And I can try to strip things away, but ultimately I can't. There are certain things I can't sort of unwind.
Limited options, really. Our imagination can only go so far. Okay, so I wanted to move now onto the topic of time, because we talked about time. I mean, time is not a very sexy topic, is it? But
I love time.
You love time, okay. Yeah. When does happiness take place?
Yeah, it's a good question. Like, it's not what is happiness, but when is happiness?
Yeah.
So look, I'm skeptical of happiness in the present, which is not to say that I think joy in the moment makes a lot of sense. And if someone says to me that the present is all we have, I have a lot of time for that view. It makes a lot of sense, right? That history happens. Well, my experience of history happens in the moment. My anticipation of the future happens in the moment.
Yep.
The moment is where everything happens, and I understand that, and I think that there's a lot of merit in that. I as an emotions theorist, I think there are limitations to that in terms of how we think about how I feel at a particular time, because I think the way that human beings think about feeling and emotion is based in reflection and is based on contemplation, and these things take time. I mean, how often do you do something and then seek validation later on? Like I might let's say I overreact and I get annoyed at my friend. I might then spend time after that trying to think about what happened. And was I right to do that? Did I overreact? Was I standing my ground? How do I contextualize or understand that conflict? That all happens after the fact, and it happens in a way that it then is kind of retroactively applied to when people say, well, what happened when you got angry at that person? And I'll say, oh, I felt resentful or something. Like I might have come to that feeling much later on. I don't think I actually felt resentful in that moment, or at least I'm not convinced that I am. And so when we talk about happiness in the present, which is like the mantra of like neoliberal happiness, right? Like carpe diem, happiness in the moment, seize the day. I do this activity with my first year students where I put happiness into Google Image and I show them all the pictures that come up. And so much of it is just like, happiness in the moment. You can choose to be happy right now. That kind of stuff is very temporal around like the present.
Yeah.
And I just don't think it's how people actually experience happiness at all. I just don't think it's works. I think I kind of adopt this perspective that to some extent I kind of borrow from someone like Hannah Arendt, who talks about this kind of blank space, which is where we live, which kind of exists between past and future, but that its borders are porous. It's not a moment. It's a kind of stretch of time that could kind of move around, and we're not exactly sure at what point the present becomes future and the past becomes present. And that this can all be completely irrelevant to most people. I think this is worth noting that like we can philosophize about these things, and I don't necessarily think that people need to walk around. I'm not like walking through Coles thinking about this. This isn't.
Why not?
No, maybe I should be. But like we can philosophize these things in ways that I think are really, really useful and important. And I think maybe what I'm really trying to get at here is that I don't necessarily think that trying to achieve emotions in the present should be the goal. Like I think emotion is always something that we reflect upon, something that we communicate, something that we compare to others, we compare to previous versions of ourselves, and that in this kind of like space in which sort of awareness happens, I think things are kind of fuzzy.
I think I might have said this last time we chatted, and you were like, I said that. I think you said something about in your book about emotions being appraisals of experience. And I loved that because it took me out of this cognitive affect dichotomy that we often see in the literature. So, how we appraise an experience is perhaps an emotion. And I was just telling Jordan about the fact that my 9-year-old had a sleepover on the weekend, And every 5 minutes or so, there was a fight that erupted. So bickering between these 9-year-old boys. And they seemed to be having meltdowns and very strong needs at various points. And then my 9-year-old, after the sleepover, was very upset because it had ended. But in the days that came, it was like a peak. It was described as like a peak experience.
Yeah.
And I think I could relate to what he was going through, not only as a child when I had those moments, but trips that I've been on that have been very difficult, like when you're like hiking or something, or you're walking for hours and your feet are hurting, and you're having all this kind of, there's discomfort, there's suffering. But when you think back on those images, either of mountains or streets, it's like, that was the best time of my life. So there's something very interesting that happens after the fact. And I think you pointed to the kind of appraisal of something. Mm-hmm. But also I was thinking about a lot of these moments that I reflect on are actually memories that come to me as images through my imagination rather than feelings. And so the feelings I had in the moment perhaps were a bit negative, like I don't want to do this, I don't want to walk anymore, or whatever it is you're feeling. But what comes to mind are the images, and somehow they make me happy thinking about them. So there's some like nuanced, complex process that's going on.
And I think the way that you feel about those images can change over time as well. A week later, a year later, 10 years later, like the way that you process those things and reflect on them will change as well. And I think we just sort of have to take that into consideration. I mean, I think one of the reasons why I'm so interested in this is that my current research looks a lot at the future and at sort of anticipatory emotions. I originally wrote this chapter about happiness as an anticipatory emotion, as a future-oriented emotion. And picking up on certain things that Ahmed has said, but also a few other people, I became very interested in the way in which, like, if happiness isn't this thing that I'm trying to feel in the moment, when is happiness? Happiness is in the future, right? Happiness is, I'm doing all of these things because I think that happiness will come, right? And then that happiness is always about projection. And there's this wonderful, this is like sort of critique from psychology that will point out that actually our projections are almost always incorrect. Like when we think, oh, I'm going to be so happy when I start that new job, or when I buy that new car, or when I get out of this relationship, or when I do whatever. We all have these ideas about like they call it affective forecasting, how we think we'll feel in the future. Human beings, as it turns out, are horrendous at this. Like the accuracy of our affective forecasts are terrible. Like we're almost always wrong in some way. It never feels the way we think it's going to feel. And yet we do it anyway, like compelled to it. We can't stop. We're always thinking about, when I'm on that holiday, or when I move house, or when I do whatever. And so I think happiness to me, in terms of the way people actually talk about it, I think is very much like pitched at the future. And in that sense, maybe happiness exists more in the future than it exists in the present, which is fine. It can be I guess in like Ahmed's work, I mean, happiness is both the carrot and the stick. It's motivation in various ways.
We are experiencing the future in the present moment through our imagination.
Yes, and that's the other thing, is that like I can feel happy about how happy I think I'm going to feel in the future. Yeah.
Well, can
I ask you a question?
All right. Yeah, go on.
So, I mean, you mentioned your son and the party, and I know that you reflect a lot on these kinds of teachings and how you frame that relationship with your children. And I was thinking about this in terms of like, we're having this conversation about what happiness is and what it does, and in a way, we're having conversations about how we should live. And I guess I'm thinking about, like, are you actively thinking about how to relay that information onto your children, or how do you structure those conversations?
Yeah, good question. There are two pieces of advice that really impacted me before I had my first son a decade ago. Buddhist pieces of advice. So the first was from one of my Buddhist teachers, who basically said, it's your job for the next 4 years to offer unconditional positive regard. And I took that really seriously. And so, I mean, it's Rogerian, but it's also Buddhist in the sense that, loving kindness and that kind of sense of unconditional love towards a child, it's an image in the Buddhist canon. So that was the premise. And so even when I got grumpy, I was still loving. So only job for 4 years, unconditional positive regard, love. Okay, even when I felt bad. And so I took that to heart. And then, because I didn't actually know what parenting was until I got there. And then the second piece of advice was from a Tibetan Buddhist teacher who talked about giving the child as much space as possible to be themselves, viewing the fact that, if they're going to harm themselves or others, you obviously need to intervene. But outside of that, it's a very laissez-faire approach to parenting. But I do think that there's some faith from a Buddhist perspective, particularly from like a Mahayana or Vajrayana perspective, that we are born with goodness. We are born with what people would call Buddha nature. So instead of being born sinful, we're born with this kind of impulse to be pro-social. And so respecting that impulse and allowing it to unfold in good time. So I try not to talk explicitly, but I try to behave, I suppose, in certain ways, because in my experience, children absorb the behaviours of their parents rather than their words. So I try and be gentle as much as possible. But yeah, and I also think the last thing I'd say about that is that my son, my nearly 10-year-old, 9-year-old, he tried to sell me a book about mindfulness because he has such disdain for the term. So he got given a birthday present, which was a book about mindfulness. And he said, "Mum, I hate this one. Will you buy it off me for $10?" And I did buy it off him, but which is shameful. But I think what it shows is that you're not doing a bad job at parenting if your children are trying to differentiate themselves from you. And so trying to make them versions of yourself, I think, is a bad idea. But honouring their own individuality and voice and expression that's my priority. So I quite enjoy that he's so contrary, and I think that's a good sign.
That's great advice. That is, as a father of a 6-year-old, I feel like you're a few years ahead. I need to get all of your wisdom into this situation. So
you've got to get some money prepared for any books on happiness that Austin tries to sell you. I think that I have a feeling my oldest is going to be an investment capitalist.
It's interesting, coming back to thinking again about Ahmed and rebellion and sort of pushing back. And I think so much of that is really valuable in terms of what Ahmed's criticizing is this society where people are punished for speaking out. People are punished for getting off the beaten path effectively and pushing back against what's expected of them. And what you're describing is actually, creating a much safer environment for experimentation and sort of safe forms of, you can reject what I've told you and you can rebel, but you will be loved, which what Ahmed is pointing out in terms of, historical, norms around gender and queerness and so on, is that love was conditional. And of course, happiness is conditional in that scenario as well. That to not be the immaculate housewife or to not be whatever it is to effectively kind of forfeit happiness. And one of the things I love in Ahmed's book there is she effectively says that feminists need to reject happiness. They need to say, you know what, you can keep it. I don't want it. If that's what it is, I don't want any part of it. And as soon as you do that, you kind of take the power away. You basically say, actually, I'm going to forge my own path. I'm going to form my own relationships, my own values. And I think there is something very powerful in that, you can't hang this over me anymore. And I think in a way it speaks to, I think, you doing the complete opposite of what has been done for a very long time to children in terms of trying to make them into a very specific thing. Sometimes I wonder if I need to give my children things to fight against, though.
You're too nice.
I need to maybe give them a sacrificial lamb to rebel against.
So you just need to pretend to be really harsh and see what happens. But yeah, that's super interesting. I often worry. I was having thoughts about how we construct the child as you were talking, and Christmas coming up and the kind of consumption that goes on, and this notion that the child is somehow greedy, inherently greedy, and we were at a Christmas thing recently, and Santa said to every child, if you're not being good, X, Y, Z. And so all these moral messages and ways that we understand surveillance. That's right. Oh, the elf is surveilling my child.
Surveillance. My son's not here, so I can say
okay. Yes,
the elf is surveillance.
Surveilling elf. And so so I have this thought about, I didn't do a lot of that in sociology. I think there is a whole branch of sociology that talks about how we construct and conceive of the child, again, as a placeholder. And we often, like everything that's banished in human culture often gets placed in the child, and people actually punish children for that. And it's very unfortunate. And I think, we're living in a world with a mental health epidemic, and people are just reluctant to talk about the formative mind and the construction of subjectivity early on in the piece, because it's either really moralistic, and it's making parents feel shameful or wrong, or they somehow are judging themselves, or it's completely cloistered because, domestic violence and all sorts of private matters that happen that are unthinkable, really. In our culture. So I think there's space there to think about children and happiness and all of those things. Maybe one day we should think about it more together. Because I think people are thirsty for this, but somehow don't talk about it enough.
Yeah. I mentioned this before. I did ask my son what his favorite emotion was last night, and he said joy very quickly. He didn't think about that answer at all. And so maybe my whole thing about temporality is maybe children are truly living in the moment. At some point, we just forget how to do that as grown-ups.
So one last point, and I think we should come to it because it is so it's such an unexpected turn in our conversation that we planned. Yes, that's right, death. So we're going to talk about death because Jordan's on a project looking at happiness and death, and it's one of my interests as well. That sounds strange. I'm interested because that's where I'm heading. So
look, I'm interested because I'm this topic has stumped me in a way that I have not experienced in some time in this space. So I have some collaborators who are working on a health trial paper, and they've been interviewing people in palliative care. The majority of people they're interviewing are in the last 6 months, basically. And in fact, to the extent that a lot of the interviews they schedule don't get to happen. Right. Yeah. And they have a question in the interview effectively about like how do these participants define the good life, and what does happiness mean to them? What does well-being mean to them? And they've brought me in effectively to try and help because the data is a bit confounding, I suppose. And I've been doing this for close to 15 years. And I don't know of anything that really helps me theorize the data set that I'm reading there. The perspectives of these people, they kind of just they don't defy reason, they don't defy logic. They defy everything that's already been written about happiness, and they really reveal just how limited I think a lot of the happiness literature is. But it also, to me, really reaffirms the future point. Because if I truly believe that happiness is future-oriented, what is happiness to a person who has no future? And has come to terms with that, and is comfortable with the fact that it's not about what's going to happen next month or next year. It's about potentially what happens in the next 10 minutes, in the next 15 minutes. And so it's less happiness as aspiration in terms of work or career or life or relationships. And it's much more about, and I mean, I don't even want to just say comfort, because it's not just about like, it's not resignation at the point where they're just like, I just want to be comfortable. It's more like not wanting to be a burden, wanting to be able to appreciate and enjoy like very simple things, seeing family, reading a book, that sort of thing. And so at the moment I'm trying to, because I've been asked to provide kind of like theoretical advice, and I'm struggling to do so because at this point, the only book I can really, I think is useful is a book by Zygmunt Bauman called Mortality, and Other Life Strategies, which is, he's very clear. It's not a book about death. It's a book about death's influence on society, death's influence on life. It's a really odd book in Bauman's trajectory, but it's one of my favorites. And one of the things that he talks about there is how, modernity, and the concept of progress very much sees itself as defying death. You know, we see science and modernity and modernization and progress as being about this way in which we have sort of won the battle against our own sort of frailty. And that death then exists as this very uncomfortable kind of elephant in the room, reminding human beings that we actually don't have anywhere near as much control as we think we do. And that the control we think we have is really severely limited. And so one of the things he points out in that book is that when you are speaking with a person who is close to end of life, much like in these interviews, it's incredibly hard to relate to them because the things that matter to you don't matter to them.
Yeah.
And the ways that you value things, the way that you make sense of what's happening to you, the frame of reference is so wildly different for that person.
Yeah.
And so you end up talking about the weather. You end up talking about things that are really superficial and meaningless because it's just, and I've been in this situation quite a few times. I know you have as well.
Yeah.
It's really confronting almost to just realize how useless you feel in that situation. And so reading through this data about people kind of reflecting on their own experiences, like that's the only sort of way in I've been able to find that I think is kind of useful in terms of what these people are talking about in end of life care is relevant for people who are not in that situation because when we're all going to die, but also because what they're saying about happiness, it's not that it's not true, but it is alien to all of the other kind of like happiness literature that exists out there.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that is kind of maybe one of the reasons why I'm wanting to have this conversation with you, because I feel like Buddhism has much more to offer in this space than the sort of like Western academic approaches.
Yeah. I mean, in a way, you're referring to like, you know, a meal or a book or a friend coming to visit. I mean, from a Buddhist perspective, that's very satisfactory. I mean, that's enough to make you happy. You don't need much more than that. And I would call that contentment, like an inner state of peace and like, oh, a friend's here. And so that's not alien to me, I don't think, or other people who practice Buddhism. But I do think that, yeah, I mean, the brain changes during the dying process, and there's a lot of literature in Buddhism on these kind of liminal bardo states. So these reference points that you're referring to, they invariably change and some drop away altogether. And sometimes people report experiencing very positive affect, actually. And their imagination is very vivid and they're able to connect with, you know, others in other supposed planes. And, you know, there are all sorts of explanations. So the experience or the life world is so different. I mean, it can be constructed as alien, but in a way, many of us have been in liminal spaces, whether we've been, you know, sick with a flu, you know, for example, or sick with cancer, or birthing a baby, or sitting alongside someone dying, and you can have a real sense of what that might be like. So, yeah, I'm really interested to hear more. I think that Buddhism, in a way, prepares you for these states because, from a Buddhist perspective, we're always experiencing small deaths as things drop away and change. And sometimes, you know, particularly through trauma and big life events, our reference points can become, you know, completely reconfigured in a flash. And so we're expecting that as Buddhists, I think. And in meditation, we can see those changes sometimes. So, yeah, that's where I'd probably leave it, I think.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Great answer.
Yeah, okay. All right. Well, look, we've got some time for questions. So we'd love to hear from the floor. If anyone has a question, please raise your hand. So online, in the room, you're all welcome. There's a lot to digest in that hour.
We've answered all the questions.
It's already asked the questions.
You can ask something a little bit more basic than what we've covered, if you like. You know, something that is more relatable is fine and applicable to our lives.
It's Joe here. Thanks so much. I was just thinking how bamboozled I am after listening to all the concepts, and which was a great discussion, by the way. I'm not just distracting from that, but it's just so complicated. And I think on the surface, we don't think as happiness in that complex way. But I was keen to understand a little bit more when you were saying that, happiness is kind of not in the moment. It's either something we reflect on or we aspire to. Can you talk about that a little bit more? Because I think, we can feel, I don't know, at ease, I suppose, in the moment, which implies there is a form of happiness. I was just keen to hear more on your thinking there.
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, so I can certainly imagine times where we might, as you mentioned around the hike, for example, like reflect on something being happy in memory, but maybe it was very difficult at the time. I always think of like the wedding day as an example of that. People often talk about the wedding day as the happiest day of your life. And yet, if it's anything like my wedding day, it was very hot and I was sunburned and was stressed and tired and catering issues. And I was kind of glad it was over when it finished. And so I think a lot of our sort of happiest moments are kind of like that. They're often not spontaneous and they're often not, I mean, they ought to be, right? They probably ought to be, but the way that we sort of put expectation on things means that we don't always sort of stop and appreciate those moments when they're really sort of happening to us, those sort of like incidental or accidental moments of happiness or joy. I think also part of that, and maybe this is something that we can talk about some more, is that I think we don't remember our emotions very well. Like, we can think of circumstances where we felt a great deal of pain or a great deal of fear or whatever, and you can't just summon that feeling again. And happiness is very similar. I mean, we spend a lot of time thinking about happiness, but we can't just like summon happiness in that, especially those really sort of intense feelings of joy. And so I think we often forget just how intense those feelings really are. And so our memories of those moments that might have actually been really beautiful and really, really genuine, our memories of them kind of get muted, and then other memories get inflated, I suppose.
Yeah.
Based on sort of how we reflect on those things.
I was thinking about your wedding day, Jordan, and I think
We weren't friends then. You should have
No.
come. It was a good day.
was it in Adelaide or
It was in Adelaide. Yeah.
Okay, we should have been friends. I was thinking about the fact that it was, full of meaning
Mhm.
about, like, it was meaning about you and your life and who you are. And so from a Buddhist perspective, there's a lot of self in the room. And it can be very exciting to imagine who you are and who you'll be in the world and who you are going forward into the future. And so I can see why happiness gets stored in those moments, as opposed to, say, a moment when I'm looking outside the window and feeling completely at ease, and enjoying the light on the tree. I mean, that's lovely, but it doesn't have such gravity, does it? Because it means nothing about me. I might make a story about like being a good meditator or something, but by and large, it means nothing about me and my future.
Right. Like meaning is really interesting there. And it's something that, so I'm lucky enough at UOW to get to teach a subject on happiness. I get to teach a whole semester, although next year is running for the final time. And so I'm making lots of jokes about the end of happiness at UOW.
God is dead and so it's
we get one more bite at the apple of happiness. But something the students every year will bring up is they will find some article where they talk about people usually in developing nations where the data suggests that they're happier than people who live these very privileged lives.
Yeah.
And I think what they get wrong there is that there is an important difference between happiness and meaning, at least in terms of the way that people talk about happiness in sort of privileged nations, where happiness is for the most part getting what you want and luxury in a sense, and meaning is purpose, and having a reason to do the things that you do. And I think like a person who has to walk 3 kilometers to get clean water for their family, I push back when people say that person is happier. I think that person leads a more meaningful life, right? And there is meaning in very simple tasks that we would potentially take for granted in Australia. because that is about, like, whether it's needing food or needing water or needing healthcare or whatever it is, like these practices are full of meaning, and you're not sort of at any point thinking, oh, why am I doing this with my life? Whereas I think in privileged nations like Australia, a lot of us are fortunate enough to not have to think about that stuff. And often means that things become really meaningless, right? Like going to Coles and buying groceries isn't meaningful, even if you are nourishing your family and even if you are creating these things. So we become spoiled, I think, in a way there. And I think there is an important kind of differentiation then between happiness and meaning in that. And it's quite different, I think, maybe to how we might construct this in a sort of a Buddhist frame of mind. But I think the thing I'm trying to push back against with my students in this is that this sort of glorification of poverty into something as like, oh, they're so lucky, they've got something that we don't have. And it's like there's a very different kind of emotional experience there and a very different understanding of meaning. But it comes off poorly, I think.
Totally. Yeah. Yeah.
There's a tone deafness there.
Yeah, definitely. And I think, I was just going to say firstly, these studies are self-report studies.
Yes.
So there's a limitation inbuilt into these studies because, your mood and there are lots of variables. If someone asked me, like right now, am I happy? A lot of things would be going on in my life that would either lead me to say yes or no,
Yes.
depending on the moment. So there's that side of it, and also about, how you're perceived by others and things like that in community. And so it might be like, it would be wrong in your community to say that you're unhappy, whereas it's cool in Western society to say that you're depressed and unhappy. No, maybe it's not. But what I'm trying to say is, the way these concepts are measured is significant. And then I wanted to just mention something that really interests me in the meditation science relates to meaning.
Mm-hmm.
And it's partly because quantitative scientists are very keen on determining whether meditation works, the extent to which it's effective. And I often think I think they do try and control for this, but I often think people enjoy meditation because meditation is meaningful and it sits within a framework and a worldview and a logic that they can relate to, and an image and it's about their future as well.
You could say the same about prayer.
Sure. And so, is it actually the act of being present in the moment that is leading to feelings of happiness, or is it the meaning that underscores the practice? So that's a super interesting topic. Yeah.
And look, there is a debate about whether we live in a world that is devoid of meaning or is losing meaning, or whether everything is meaningful. And the phenomenologists, I think, have been on about this for a very long time. And I think my perspective on this kind of much like the de-emotionalization stuff, I think there are things that are increasingly devoid of meaning, and we are trying to find ways to reinvest and reconnect with meaningful acts, whatever that happens to be. And I think meditation is absolutely got to be one of these ways that people kind of give you're provided with a structure in a sense for reconnecting with meaning, and that I think is something that we've kind of maybe lost and probably needs to be remade. It's not just going to happen by itself.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you, Joe, for your question. Is there anyone else who would like to ask a question? Yes. Yeah.
Can they hear?
Yeah, I think if you go a little bit closer, Steph.
Actually, I was thinking about where you were talking about Marx earlier, and this is not directly related to happiness, perhaps, I don't know, but I was interested in what you were thinking in terms of the young and the old Marx, and I guess my background is in music analysis, and so we talk about late style and the interesting work has been done there on the things that contribute to that include that somebody might be going blind or going deaf, or as part of the aging process, and how can you read this in their work, kind of thing. But so I guess it was just a bit of thinking along that sense of what you sort of talked about as the trajectory of the young personal Marx towards the structuralist Marx, and was it, to what extent, I guess, do you see this as a kind of personal journey of aging, or is it also, and or is it the intellectual journey that he's on, and he's just pursued it, and then that's where it leads him, or is it a kind of zeitgeist, and it's something bigger than Marx himself? I was just curious.
That's a great question. So there's an interesting thing there where the late Marx was translated first, and people didn't discover early Marx until much later. And so, in terms of how people actually over the 20th century sort of learned about Marx, for a long time there only was late Marx, and that the early stuff was more of a discovery later on. And so, for some people, they don't take it too seriously. I mean, I think there is a kind of like a youthful, I mean, some would say naivety, but I think a kind of like youthful joy in the earlier material, which I think, yeah, does I think look at the scale of society in very different ways. And you can certainly read the later material as becoming more pessimistic and more deterministic even. He certainly has a lot less faith in human agency to make to make changes as time goes on. But I think also, I mean, there's probably, in terms of a personal trajectory for him, I think there's a certain amount of I don't know, cynicism, I suppose, that just kicks in over time. I mean, he's writing throughout the sort of middle of the 1800s, and he's fleeing countries, and he's surviving on the donations of friends. He's not able to hold down a university job. He's the romance, I think, eventually kind of dissipates, and his work becomes very economically focused and very, very, very structuralist over time. But I think he remains. I think again, this question of human welfare and human well-being still remains the kind of North Star for him. Like, I think ultimately, like Marx's what makes him distinct from a lot of the other sort of canonical social theorists is that he's not just talking about what society is, he's talking about how society should be, right? I mean, he does both, but he's not trying to be an objective observer. He is trying to change history. And I mean, maybe one of the only major figures in sociology who's ever sort of pulled that off. I guess it's a dangerous place to be.
Yeah, other questions from the floor, online? Jody.
It's not entirely a question. It's more, many thoughts happening simultaneously. But yeah, I guess following on from what Joanne said and what you touched on afterwards in terms of, well, not just the difference between meaning and happiness, but the meaning of happiness, and kind of the need, starting with an idea of what is the definition of happiness, and being comfortable with the idea that there is a spectrum of happiness. So like what Nadine said about, happy, like one of the challenges is that happiness is self-reported, and I do understand in terms of a research basis that can be challenging, but it can't really be anything else but self-reported. If I say I'm happiness, who are you to say that I'm not, right? And what makes me happy may be very different from what makes you happy. And yes, feasibly someone living in what we might consider in a Western environment as very deprived, and I think anyone who's traveled in developing countries has seen that for themselves, right? That without being, in some ways, living very close to everything that you can have makes you less happy, right? So just because you live in a developed country doesn't necessarily translate directly into happiness. So I guess where my thought was going in terms of, tackling this is, well, of course, we're, like if we think of Aristotle, etc., that, there's temporary and there's lasting forms of happiness, which I guess is generally accepted, and that it could be contentment, it could be satisfaction, it could be joy, it could be a whole bunch of things, right, that equate to happiness. It could be momentary happiness, or it could be lasting happiness. So I guess that's where my mind was going, that perhaps if we lock in too hard on trying to nail it down, that's a trap in itself. And then in terms of Buddhism, I mean, Nadine might be able to comment on this more. I was just thinking about, ultimate happiness in terms of Buddhism being the opposite of dukkha, so sukha, but that being complete liberation from suffering, which is not something many people are going to achieve. So while there's a pursuit of happiness in Buddhism, it's not your typical pursuit of happiness, or your Western pursuit, or current Western's pursuit of happiness. And anything else that's attached happiness, like happiness attached to something, is going to be by its nature temporary. And the whole goal of Buddhism being to remove that attachment to the temporary. So I don't know if I explained that very well, but yeah, I guess just maybe being a little bit more relaxed about the definition of happiness, and also knowing that any attempt to attach it to something is probably only ever going to mean it's temporary.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right. And I think the point about we can't decide how happy another person is. We can only trust their subjectivity on this is completely correct. I mean, I think something I've been harping on about for a long time in this space is that the far majority of happiness research is quantitative. The discipline that does the most happiness research is economics, followed by psychology, and the economists mostly employ psychologists to do this work for them. But like they are the two areas that by far invest the most money in doing happiness research. And it frustrates me that so much of their work is about happiness measurement as opposed to a more qualitative attempt to kind of understand. Like I'm much more interested in the question, like, what is happiness to you, than how happy are you? Because the how happy are you question assumes that it's the same for you as it is for me. And in fact, it makes a lot of different kinds of assumptions. Whereas I'm much more interested in hearing how people define happiness, or what it means to them. And that to me tells me much more about them, but it's also much messier data. The kind of data that people love in this space is they want to be able to say that, married people are happier than unmarried people. They want to say that, people over the age of 50 are happier than people under the age of 50, or something like that. Like, they're the kinds of headlines that a lot of these sort of research projects want to be able to release. The main happiness data collection tool is called the Cantrell ladder. And it's a question where they basically say to a person, on a scale from 1 to 10, how happy are you with your life as a whole? And they've been using this for decades. And it's convenient because it's a single measurement that can be tacked on to any other surveys. So if you've got surveys where you're asking about housing affordability or something, you can throw this question in at the end and then get reference points for, like, how happy are this cohort compared to that cohort. And it lets you sort of come up with these sorts of associations. But of course, correlation is not causation. And this stuff does get very messy very quickly. And there's some really interesting work in linguistics, actually, that has critiqued these sorts of studies and effectively tried to say that, there's a real translation error here, that there are countries there are languages where there might be a dozen different words that you could use for happiness that all have their own kind of distinct differences in meanings. And depending on which one you use, it's going to influence, how people answer it. And overwhelmingly, the happiest countries are always these kind of Nordic countries, right? It's always Iceland, Denmark, Norway, Sweden. And there are a lot of linguists from that part of the world who have really pushed back on this and said that these countries are not very happy. It's just that the words that they're using for happiness there are more like, I'd be happy to help you move that couch, as opposed to, like, I'm not joyous about helping you move the couch, but I'm willing to do it. Or, like, a student might say that they're happy with their grade, which means that they got the grade they think they deserved, not necessarily a grade that makes them happy. And it's a really different kind of use of the word. And so if you think about it that way, and then you ask a population of people, how happy are you? They'll probably be like, yeah, it's fine. And then all of a sudden they're repeatedly, Denmark's the happiest country in the world. And so there are real issues there with what those numbers actually mean. And I think, sorry, this is a very long answer to this question, but I think what I would come back to is when we see data that says, oh, Australians are a 7.4 out of 10 happiness, what that means to me is that Australians think that they're a 7.4. It's not that they are. Like, I don't actually think that number has any real meaning. But it means that that's their self-evaluation, that's how they think they feel, or that's how they think their lives are going, which is, of course, not the same as how they actually feel the majority of the time.
Thank you.
Thank you.
I would say if you're interested in reading up on any of this, by far the most reliable source is the World Happiness Report, which comes out every year. It's usually published around, I think, March or April. It is extremely well funded as a sort of global happiness study, mostly led by economists and psychologists. And there's a lot that I don't like about it, but it is, if you're looking for global happiness data, it's free and it's easily the most usable and reliable. And every year the issue that they effectively publish this book. And they have their different themes, which I think is really interesting. Like they did a year on migration. They've done years on social isolation. Sorry. They do, I think, quite a good job of actually kind of unpacking all of that stuff.
We've got time for one more question. Anyone else wanting to ask something? Annie, hi.
Hi, I do have a question as I'm quite fascinated by this topic in particular. Where do you think, I guess, this desire or obsession for, saying that we're happy, where do you think that came from? Because is it social influence? Is it, a societal expectation? Is it, I'm just really kind of fascinated where you both kind of feel that originated from, because Western perspective and Buddhist perspective are both very contradictory a lot of the time, very polarizing. So I do wonder if you could kind of give some more insight onto where you think that has come from.
Do you know about the etymology?
Sorry.
Do you know about the etymology of happiness?
So there has been some stuff published on how the word has been used over time, like using like Google Ngram, for example, and looking at like how it's been used in publications over time. I think my kind of cheeky answer to this, I think, is that we've become really competitive about happiness. And I think we have, like, in terms of in the last 30 years, I think part of the interest in happiness has come from being so like intimately aware of each other's lives, partly through things like social media and technology, just being much more aware of what other people have and how other people live, and that this maybe makes happiness like in the same kind of way that one might try to keep up with the Joneses or whatever, have a car that's as nice as my neighbor's. Like, I think there's an element of sort of competitive happiness in that sense, or of like feeling as though I'm missing out on something that everybody else has and I need to catch up. But I mean, you're right in that, like, there's been an enormous growth in the interest in this word over time, and that it has, in terms of etymology, it has shifted somewhat from happiness as luck and good fortune to happiness as sort of like something that I'm going to have. And I think there's a really interesting parallel there between happiness and love. And I think of someone like Eva Alou, her work on, she wrote this beautiful book called Why Love Hurts. And one of the things she writes about in that book is that people there was a time where people did not expect to love their partner. Like you married for economic reasons and traditional reasons, and if you got someone good and you liked them, you got lucky. And I think similarly there was a long time there where people didn't expect to live happy lives necessarily. Like, that wasn't the goal and it wasn't an expectation. And I think now it's very much an expectation. People expect to find a true love and they expect to be happy. And then they feel this enormous sense of disappointment and loss if those things don't happen the way that they want them to. And so I think people have sort of taken this task of like, how do I find happiness, in the way that we've taken on to lots of other tasks about, health and fitness or financial goals or whatever. It becomes very goal oriented.
Yes. And I think we've talked about this before. We've talked about like a bit of a narcissistic turn in our culture. And so, I think even my grandmother's generation were very much focused on duty,
Yes.
and social ties and living an honourable life, living a life that fulfilled certain social roles, that of wife, that of mother, whatever else they were doing, community service. And for men, it was, military. And so the kind of virtue that I suppose the virtue of the day was duty. And there was a shift, I think, culturally. And I think it happened, in the 60s and 70s where, one's personality and ability to charm others became the focus of people's lives. And so all of a sudden, psychology began to gain a lot of momentum. And we started to see an individual's personality and capacities as the locus for, a good life or happiness. And so it was no longer about what you do for others, but it was about who you are. And so I think therapy culture has had a lot to do with that. And Oprah Winfrey, we're just talking about Oprah being in Sydney. And so, these types of pop psychological approaches to how we live in the world. And so, individualism, I suppose, runs alongside that. So, and I would just say that, I was thinking back to my grandmother as you were talking, who was a Sephardic Jewish woman, but she would use the word inshallah, which means God willing. And so, because she spoke Arabic as well, and she, every time there was good news, she'd say inshallah, God willing. And so it's like this sense that happiness is not even in your hands, it's in another power's hands. And whether you come across happiness or not is not your decision. So it is very much about hapstance, as you mentioned, luck. So super interesting to track the genealogy of the word as it's unfolded. Yeah,
Probably much easier just to think of it as luck and not
luck.
It de-stresses the situation. But the person I really like on this, there's a Japanese academic, Shigeru Oishi, Oishi, who has written quite a lot about like cross-cultural comparisons. And like I think one of his analyses looks at the use of the word happiness in presidential addresses in the United States and like over time and how they work, but it's also compared like dictionary definitions from different languages in different countries, and looked at that over, and then like the Google Ngram stuff and looking at the way that happiness has been used in published texts over hundreds of years. That's really fascinating.
Cool. Well, I think we're bang on too. So I want to thank everyone for your attention and your questions and your presence. It's been lovely to see you all and wishing you all happiness over the course of the festive season. So take care and a lot of luck as well. Yeah.
Thank you.
See you.